Welcome to the Supply Chain Dialogue Season 3, Episode 6. I'm Daniel Helmig. This is the last episode before the summer quarter break this year. We will return in October. So I'm thrilled that we go out with a bang. Today I'm joined by a special guest, someone who's been a friend and colleague for many years and now holds the esteemed position of Chief Procurement Officer at American Airlines, the one and only Dan Bartel. He's the former Chief Procurement Officer, or CPO as they are called, of global companies such as the French Schneider Electric, the Swiss-based ABB, and the US-based Thomas & Betts. He's happily married, has 3 brilliant kids. He lived with his family in the US, Switzerland, Hong Kong, and Eastern Europe. And now he spends his time between Dallas, Texas, and Barcelona in Spain. We've known each other for years. It's been amazing to watch Dan's career soar. And now he's leading procurement at one of the most iconic brands, American Airlines. So when we decided to do this talk, we thought about something that we consistently had in common in our respective careers. Getting back to basics. Re-establishing a baseline when it comes to procurement. Frankly, the state of procurement in many organizations is, well, let's just say it's not inspiring. So we're talking about how to change stagnant KPIs, rising cost, disenfranchised internal customer departments, and a team that feels undervalued. So since many of the people we know have taken over responsibility in procurement organizations around the world, Dan and I thought we would take a step back from the season's focus and remember the core principles of good procurement. As Henry Ford famously said, coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success. We'll explore practical strategies for building stronger relationships with internal customers, optimizing processes, and most importantly, people. I hope you will find Dan's insights as interesting as I did. We had a fascinating conversation despite the fact that technology failed us a bit, and we needed to record the whole thing with an iPhone. So with that, Dan, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Daniel. Thank you.
It's fantastic that we have the time to see each other again. Long time no see. Before we get into the depth of our back to basics sessions, just what's the one idea you think most people get wrong from your perspective?
Yeah, most CPOs tend to overlook the plain and simple fact that the most impacting element of our function is the people that are running it, right? There's lots of sexy tools and technologies these days that probably we'll talk about in today's session, right? There's also many of us are working hard to streamline our processes, to make us easier to do business with both internally and externally. All these things can add a lot of value. But at the end of the day, if you don't have great people, you're not going to make very good progress. And all the things around tools and technology, your competitors can copy that sometimes relatively easily, but they can't copy your people. So if you want to use procurement as a strategic advantage for your company, get the best possible people that you can find and don't settle. And, everyone is focused on people and learning and development and talent management. But I just think that if you pick one thing that you just can't afford to get wrong, it's people.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And how many times I've learned in the past that if you do not get the right people at the job, or you feel that they will do at some point in time after 2 years, it kicks you in the behind and it doesn't work. So fully with you. Okay, let's start this session back to basics. We will start talking about strategy and goals, then go into a structure and the roles of an organization, all more or less linked to people. Then we will go into the processes and technology because they're part of this as well. Touch on supplier management and risk management, on continuous improvement, and then we call it a day. So let's start with strategy and goals. You mentioned people are the most important thing, but as well, people need to work in a setting, in an environment, in a procurement organization. So how do you think a procurement organization should align with the company's organization and the business strategy?
And I think you need to start by just understanding the strategy, the plan, and the objectives of the business that you're supporting. And then simply orient everything you do around that, right? It's how you organize yourself, what targets you set, what your priorities are. At the end of the day, procurement is enabling the business to be successful. It's one of the key enablers in most industries, right? So just understanding where the business is going and how it's planning to get there is a really important first step. Just a couple of examples from my experience in Schneider Electric, which was recently named by Time Magazine as the most sustainable company in the world. Obviously, sustainability is a huge priority. So we had very high expectations in procurement, deliver world-class sustainability results with our suppliers, all facets of ESG. So we really leaned into that hard, driving carbon reduction, ensuring decent work at our suppliers, and had many initiatives around that, far more intense than is typical even in that industry. But we didn't do it just because we thought it was a good idea. We did it because that's what the business wanted. And then if I think about in my current role as the CPO of American Airlines, most airlines really are focused on two main things, and it's not different for us. One is reliability, make sure the planes are taking off and completing as many flights as possible on time safely, and cost. It's a low margin industry, so it's super important to manage that cost very, very carefully and drive efficiency. So in this case, it's reliability and cost. And maybe people miss that because there's a formula. There's a standard formula you can apply to building a procurement function in just about any kind of business. But if you don't stop and think about what the business is trying to achieve, you're going to miss some important points.
Okay. Oh, well said. And when you have the strategy set as such and aligned as well with the business strategy, I said, what is the best way to effectively communicate and align the procurement goals and the priorities with stakeholders across different departments within a company? Normally, they are not always friendly directly from the start. So how do you think this works best? What is your experience?
Yeah, I would take a similar approach as an enterprise level with each of the businesses inside or the stakeholder groups that you're supporting. So invest time and energy in understanding what each department is trying to accomplish and do everything you can to help enable that. It sounds really simple, but when you get into those details, you can find some pretty diverse things. And of course, build your KPIs based on what that business is trying to achieve. It's okay to have some things on your own, right? Most of us want to drive procure-to-pay efficiencies, for example, and our stakeholders might not be thinking about that as a big priority, but Absolutely. We shouldn't be shy to ask for help where we need it. But we should start with where they need help, helping our stakeholders succeed first. And maybe the last thought about that question, Daniel, which is a good one, is what I'm talking is a lot of bottom-up activity. So get with the business, understand what they're trying to do, really work with them, show them a lot of support. It's important to also have top-down endorsement from the group. I think that's you need both those dynamics going, kind of creating a push-pull with your stakeholders. I think we saw that at ABB in our experience together there. I see you nodding your head, where we spent a lot of time sitting with stakeholders trying to understand what they needed, also selling them on the idea of some of the changes that we were driving and how we support them. And at the same time, we had some support from the top down to make sure that the change was going through with pace. And I think both of those aspects are critical for success in any kind of procurement transformation.
Yes, they are. Absolutely. You talked about ABB, and there we went through together to some extent until you left us and went to Schneider. But we went from a hybrid organizational structure to a decentralized structure, which at the end, if you look today, is rather successful if you look at the share price, which more than doubled. But they are probably not the one optimal organization for procurement, depending on what the overall structure of a company is. And clearly this is of interest for me because since I've done that once, that's as well where I work with my clients here today. So from your perspective, what do you think is the optimal organizational structure for a procurement team to actually deliver the most, considering company size, industry, and complexity?
It's like an impossible question to answer, right. But I'll give it a go.
But I thought I'd do it with you, because when someone can answer impossible questions, it's Dan.
No, I guess the easy answer is there is no answer, right? I don't think when it comes to organization design, I don't believe that there's any perfect answer. There's always trade-offs. When you go for a more central approach, you have consistency in how you approach things across all the businesses and across all the supplier relationships. There's advantages there facing suppliers. Then you create some disadvantages perhaps internally, and how you work with your stakeholders. And then the more decentralized approach tends to put you in a better position to engage with stakeholders internally, makes it harder to work together externally with suppliers. You always say you have those kind of trade-offs in any kind of organization design. I tend to, in my experience, organizing first around the business and second around suppliers, but trying to get the right balance of both. And I can give a good example. In procurement, we buy different categories, we cluster suppliers into categories, we create organizations around categories. And usually nobody else in the business cares about categories except procurement. So we got to be careful not to overdo that dimension and become something that our business partners and stakeholders can't really understand. And I'll give you an example of just the way that we recently set up the category teams in American Airlines. We didn't call the category teams after the categories that they're buying. We named them after the stakeholders that they're supporting. For example, there's some obvious things like we have a category team for technical operations. That's all of the spare parts, overhaul services, engines, all the thing it takes to keep airplanes flying. It's a good alignment between the categories and our stakeholders. Technical operations is a department in the company. But if you look at some of the other categories, we have another one that is called crew. What is that? That's hotels. So all of the crew rest hotels, displaced passenger hotels, the uniforms for crew, the training for our crew, for our flight attendants and our pilots. We put that all into one category organization. We call it crew. That's the stakeholders that they're supporting. Now, when I recruit that role externally, I can't call it that because no one understands what that is. But everybody internally, all 130,000 employees of our company, know what the crew means. It means our flight attendants and our pilots. Somewhat subtle, but a super effective way of positioning yourself in the organization so that you can be understood and it's clear what the mission is of the organization.
It's interesting that you pointed out, because I think that is as well a lesson learned that I had over time. So I think this is absolutely true. You're right on the money there. Fully with you. When you now look at the people that you would like to have that interface with an internal customer on the one hand side, but as well then be able to work with suppliers, understand markets, do the analysis, what skills and experiences should we prioritize when recruiting for different procurement roles?
Yeah, the first thing I think about nowadays, maybe it's a bit of a phrase, but business acumen is really important. I want category leaders to be good business people, right? And I think we used to say at ABB, to run your category like you're the CEO of the category. Really people that can feel the accountability of the end-to-end process and really take responsibility for the overall business result rather than just to their specific set of KPIs. And people that can understand the business, that either they know it or they can learn it, right? I think also about all the usual procurement type skills like negotiation, data analytics, financial analysis, all the things you need in your toolkit to be a good buyer. Maybe it's quite obvious, but I think it's important to state that. And it's something that we assess pretty closely when hiring people. And then I would say, when I think about my team, I want people with a variety of experience. So a balance between real, true procurement experts in the industry, experts in the categories that they're buying. It just depends on the role. We talked about hotels. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to buy hotels. If you are a rocket scientist, you can also buy hotels because it's not that hard of a category to learn. But there's another area in my spend where it's much more complex. Construction services. So when you think about building a terminal at the airport. Different airports operate in different ways, but usually it's an airline that's managing that construction. So you can have a multi-billion-dollar construction project. The category leader for something like that needs to have some expert knowledge in construction surfaces, right? So there's one area where you need to have a certain type of experience in order to be able to do the job. But overall, I look for a balance, I would say, of experience profiles. So I do think that you talk about diversity, whether ethnic background or gender, you want to have a mix in your team. I think diversity of experience is important as well to bring all different perspectives to the table. And then the last thing I would say about that is, I don't know if you call this experience or qualifications or skills, but it's more personality type. I want to have a balance of hunters and farmers. The hunters, people that go out aggressively, negotiate, and are really tough and don't take no for an answer, both with suppliers and with their stakeholders. And then the farmers who more are building relationships for the long term and maybe take a slower pace, but go deeper and have their own way of being effective. I think, again, different situations, different categories, different types of businesses need those different types of personalities. And that's an important aspect that I think is easy to overlook when you're just looking at, okay, what kind of experience, what kind of skills, what kind of achievements has this person made? You need to get inside their head as well and understand how they tick, how they're wired, and make sure that you have, again, the right type of personality for the job that you're trying to take forward.
These are good points. I think it's difficult to figure that out in an interview. And I think for that, how do you, for example, run interviews? Do you do it one interview and that's it? Or do you have several people interviewing the candidates?
I think it's a whole other podcast. But because there's so many ways you can approach that. My philosophy is to have just enough people to make enough of a judgment about these things, but not so many that there's too many cooks in the kitchen to slow you down. But yeah, it's something you need to try to assess in the interview. I think also reference checks often can become a box checking exercise for companies.
Yep.
But if you ask the right kind of questions in those reference checks, you can get some insights into how people are.
Okay, now we have talked a lot about people because, as you rightly said, it's the most important thing, and how we structure them to work together and put them in an organization. Let's move to the topic of process and technology. We have specific procurement processes that we need to run. How do you effectively integrate procurement processes with other business and operational functions so that they do not feel it to be a burden, but actually a value add?
I think you need to find the right point of engagement. When I think about the airline, for example, we buy many, many, many different things in order to support those planes flying. And we have a very varied group of stakeholders. And if we just have one approach to how we buy everything, we would be extremely sub-optimized in the view of our stakeholders. We might be super efficient, but the airline's not going to run well. And in the opposite side of it, if we just customize everything we do with each individual stakeholder, we'll have a monster that we won't be able to manage. Finding the right middle ground there, I think, is important. When I think about, again, using the airline as an example, again, technical operations, it runs like a normal supply chain. They have an inventory management, they have part numbers that they're buying, they have certain rigorous quality processes to be followed. That looks very different than onboard catering, which again cares about all the same things, wants to have the right inventory in the right place at the right time, but is a completely different animal. So as a result, our procurement processes have to be different. They have to be different for those two things. But at the end of the day, I do need to boil it down to what is the overall performance of my procurement organization. And that, coming back to our earlier questions about organization design and thinking about how the organization or what the business is trying to achieve. And I mentioned in an airline, it's reliability and it's cost. I can say for every one of my stakeholder groups, those are their two priorities. They have a lot of other things. They define those things in different ways, but they want to achieve a high level of reliability at a competitive level of cost. How you get there in each of those different categories is a little different and is the complexity that we need to manage.
Okay, good. Fully with you on that. Now, in the context, so we talked a little bit about processes, that we keep it light on this regard. Now let's talk as well briefly about technology. And it might be too early to already, for American Airlines, say anything in terms of how this can be managed. But from your experience, how can technology, including the procurement software and data analytics tool, which became more and more important, can be effectively leveraged to optimize our procurement processes as such? What do you think?
Yeah, I've got a certain formula for that seems to work well. The first thing is master data. You got to get that right. You could have the prettiest, sexiest technology. You could have an incredible AI, but if you're feeding it garbage, you're going to get garbage on the other end. And that's something that you and I always struggled with at ABB. I struggled with it at Schneider. I struggled with it at American Airlines. I think everybody has the same challenge. But and it's never perfect, but having the reasonably good master data is the most important starting point. And then I think just having a good end-to-end platform for the basic procurement processes from source to settle, one backbone where you can link in then other technologies. That's important. For a lot of companies, it's their ERP, like SAP. Yep. It could be a procurement suite like Coupa, but some kind of a backbone that you can build everything around is important. And then there's so many great new technologies constantly hitting the market in the procurement space. It's a super fast-moving space with a steady stream of new players. You need to be able to take those new awesome technologies and plug them in where you need them. So whether it's some kind of high-tech sourcing optimization or an AI tool or a super robust spend analytic technology, whatever the case may be, to take that best in breed and plug it into your platform. And, when it's run its course, unplug it and throw it away, right? And look for the next great thing. But that's how I see technology architecture. Now, it's interesting because you and I experienced at ADP like a Frankenstein situation where you have all these ERP installations everywhere and you try to piece things together with a lot of legacy technology running in the background. Fortunately, in American, we have SAP, we have Coupa, we have some of these basic things, but I don't have a big legacy of technologies in the background. So it's quite interesting that we're aiming to go for this kind of Coupa as the backbone and then bring in those cool, sexy point solutions, best in breed solutions when and where they're needed to take the most advantage of those technologies that are on the market as fast as you can.
Okay, so moving on to supplier management and risk mitigation. Now, you mentioned that reliability and cost management and cost efficiency are the most important things that right now your internal customers will look for from you to provide. How do you shape that into supplier relationships and performance management to ensure this consistent reliance, reliability, and cost efficiency?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I would come back to our discussion about processes. Before we engage a supplier in an RFP, we want to first understand and clarify with our business partners what they want. What is the result that they're aiming for with this process? Whether it's a clear statement of work or a clear SLA, service level agreement, terms that are very clearly defined up front, what we want the supplier to do for us. It sounds obvious, but it's surprising to me how often people skip that step or brush by it too quickly. And by the way, you can engage suppliers in helping you define that. There's nothing wrong with that through something like a request for information type process. But before you really go for formal RFP, define as clearly as you can what you want the suppliers to do. And then baking that into the RFP, baking those things later into the contract, it sets a clear expectation from the very beginning of the relationship of what you're expecting them to deliver and also what your role is as the buyer in that. We also like to include, in many cases, penalties for poor performance and also rewards or bonus for exceeding expectations. Companies tend to act based on financial performance first and foremost. So if you can bake those KPIs into hard dollars, it has a very big impact in terms of enabling the performance of the supplier. And then I would say, just overall, you need to have a good supplier relationship management process. So the category manager needs to be really clear about where are the relationships in the organization from the C-level down to the ground level, who engages with who at which level. And then, of course, a good cadence, an appropriate cadence of meetings at those different levels to drive the performance forward. Ideally, with those suppliers that are strategic, we want to have a contact, if not with the CEO, at least at his or her -1 level. And then you define it all the way down to the ground level of who's involved in managing that relationship. And you make sure that there's a good cadence of those people having interactions where they can deal with the problems and just overall advance the relationship forward.
Okay, no, fully with you. No, that's true. And then you have selected the wonderful supplier and we're all happy to go hand in hand into the sunrise, and then reality hits, which could be COVID, which can be a volcano erupting, it can be strikes somewhere. When you look at supplier management and risk mitigation, what are the critical risks that are associated with supply chains, whether now in your current employer or just in general, in terms of what you have experienced, and what strategies did you utilize to mitigate these risks?
Yeah, when it comes to risk, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. All of us have some pretty big scars over the last few years. You mentioned COVID. The semiconductor crisis of the previous few years was the worst that the industry has ever seen. There's been some really crazy weather events. There are wars going on. All of these things impact supply chains. What type of risks? All types of risks. I think what's key is understanding the likelihood and the impact, and doing that assessment thoroughly through your supply chain. And let's say most big organizations with professional procurement departments have some level of risk monitoring on their suppliers, but also most of them are doing it only on the first tier. So what we learned in Schneider over the previous 5 or so years that I was there was that when there was a disruption, most of the time, a majority of the time, the severe ones, was not with the tier one supplier. It was somewhere further upstream. So a lot of hard lessons were learned there. And what we did was we just took our risk management processes and we applied them on further upstream on the more riskier nodes of the supply chain. I think that's a very smart reaction. It's not easy. It requires, first and foremost, an understanding of that multi-tier supply chain, which is something that most companies don't systematically understand. So the mapping itself can be a very big exercise. And then you have to engage, right, with suppliers that are in markets that you're not familiar with. So there's an organizational level of learning that has to happen before you can be successful in managing those tiers further upstream. But that's, I think, a super important aspect. And then if I take it forward to my experience in the airline, there's a number of categories where they're really, you can't have two suppliers running at the same time in case something goes wrong with one of them, because it's too uneconomical. I mentioned catering services before. That's a good example. At most airports, there's one catering service that has the lion's share of the volume and therefore the most competitive cost and the most reliable service. But if something does go wrong with that one, then you really have no alternative. So the focus in those kind of situations is on business continuity. So what are we going to do to make sure nothing goes wrong? What are all the preventative steps that can be taken? And then in the event that something does go wrong, what is our backup plan? Maybe it's double provisioning where you fly 2 sets of meals inbound to that station, so you have one for the departing flight. To cap it off, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. It's just a matter of time. And I think always thinking about and planning for those eventualities is a super important success factor in managing the risk.
Now, let's move to the last section. So we have the structure set up, we have the processes and the technology set up, we have our strategy aligned, and we even know how to basically manage suppliers and do risk mitigation. So from your perspective, what can be a robust performance monitoring and reporting system that is light, but strong enough to actually get the job done from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a very good point to balance between light, so you don't have all this heavy reporting and too many people spending too much time just reporting instead of actually improving things, but not too light where it doesn't give you any useful insights. And I think that's a difficult balance for some companies to strike. I can give an example from my current experience on this one. We are reporting cost reduction, obviously, at a detailed level. And cost reduction is actually part of our short-term incentive. So it's part of the bonus payout for the company, which for a procurement leader, it's fantastically powerful to have that, because then you have everybody in the organization wants you to be successful because it affects their own wallet. It's not the answer to getting support of your stakeholders, but it's one of them, and it's a good one that works. But the flip side of it is, because it's in the short-term incentive, our numbers are getting audited to an extremely detailed level. At the very beginning, we were really struggling, and we still struggle to some degree, but far less, with how do we create all the documentation around these cost reduction reportings in a way that satisfies the auditors, but doesn't require an army of people. So I think, like anything else, defining what you want and then stripping that down to what do you really need in order for this reporting to be adequate for audit purposes. And then having a process that is as standardized across all those categories as possible, as streamlined as possible, as simple as possible, and then bring the team some support. I can't have every category leader spending too much time on this, and I'd rather have them in front of suppliers, in front of stakeholders, creating value. At the same time, I can't afford to have them reporting numbers that aren't real. So we bring them also some external support to help them in that reporting. But it's a fine line that you got to find yourself between kind of this good enough reporting and reporting that's so light that you don't get the insights that you need.
Yeah, this is always something that for every company you have to figure out. But what American Airlines has, they already established, seems to be fantastic, because it gives you a leg up in terms of working together. Which brings us to the last functional question, actually, which is working together. What do you think should be done from a procurement perspective to foster collaboration and communication between the procurement team as such and other organizational stakeholders? What needs to happen besides having that part of the incentive plan?
No, it's a lot more than that. Yeah, that helps, but it's not everything. I talked before about categories versus stakeholder groups. I think that's an important enabler, that if we show the organization that we're organized around them, they become much more willing to work together with us. So that's one thing that helps. And then also procurement, we need to be represented in the staff meetings and in the staffs, really, of our stakeholders. So we talk a lot about the CPO having a seat at the table, as they say. And that's important, but that has to permeate down through the whole organization. My category leader for ops, for example, he is attending the staff meetings of the SVP of Technical Operations. He's considered part of that person's staff. He spends more time with him than he does with me. And that's the way we want it to be. So having the seat at the table throughout all levels of the organization, a super important aspect, I think. And then maybe it's boring and dry, but I would say also having common objectives and setting common goals together, agreeing up front what we're going to achieve together, avoid working against each other, and rather make sure that we're collaborating and all working toward the same objectives.
Sounds good. It's interesting when you mentioned seat around the table. Since I have left the corporate life, I had the opportunity to look at my old notes. And interestingly enough, I started in procurement in 1984. And I found a note that I made at that point in time that one of my managers said that we should have a seat at the table. So, I think we would probably can go back 50 years and we would see the same thing. My answer to this today and for most of my later career was, you have to earn your seat at the table. You have to be interesting and good enough to earn this seat on the table. You have to be good at it and you have to solve something that they like. But I know that this is something which you always were able to do. You always had the seat on the table, and I'm pretty sure you get this as well. The organization.
You showed me how to do it, man.
Yeah, we both. Look, thank you so much, Dan. This was great, very insightful, as well as seeing how your thinking has evolved since the last time we said, and the experiences from Schneider are quite interesting as well for me in being a former professional in this area. Now, before I let you go, tell me your favorite quote, Dan.
My favorite quote? Okay, there's one I'd love to share with your audience. That was one that I repeat often, actually. And I usually give the person who said it first credit, but sometimes I forget. It was you, talking about how economies of scale in procurement are important, but more important are economies of skill. I use that all the time. I believe it. It's absolutely 100% true. Economies of scale versus economies of skill. One of my favorite quotes. But I won't leave you with just that. Because another one I want to mention, and it's a Dwight D. Eisenhower quote. Mm-hmm. He said that plans are useless, but planning is essential. So you need to go to battle with a plan. You also need to expect that within the first few minutes of battle, that plan is going to be useless and you have to replan. You talked about risk management earlier. It applies there. We're running an airline where every day we go into the day with a plan. Things happen, whether it's weather or congestion or technical issues that disrupt the airline. And what I love is that our teams are amazing at replanning, at finding new solutions, making sure that we complete those flights. So, yeah, plans are useless, but planning is essential. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Absolutely. Dan, thank you so much for the interview. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. It was great. Pleasure was mine.
So you see, procurement, if managed well, can be a profit engine, a sustainability champion, and a resource for brilliant commercial and emotionally savvy managers for the whole company. All it takes is a great chief procurement officer, a motivated team, and the will of the management board, or at least the CEO, to support the change coming. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Supply Chain Dialogues, despite the audio issues we had. If you did, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, or any other major podcast platform. And if you are a subscriber, tell a friend, colleague, or any decision maker in your company. We believe in word of mouth instead of making marketing tricks and superfluous emails. If you would like to contact Dan, ping him via LinkedIn. If you like to reread the transcript, check out our website, helmigadvisory.com, and go to the podcast section with the linked transcripts. You will find as well a bunch of other topics to peruse. With that, stay safe, be bold, and see you after the summer break in October. During this time, we will work heavily on bringing you actionable and/or interesting content that you can use in your daily professional lives. These are the supply chain dialogues produced and copyrighted by Helmig Advisory AG in 2024.